Thank you very much for inviting me. Since it's AVI USA, I'm sure that a lot of what I'm going to say is familiar, but I will try to sprinkle in some things that you might not be so aware of to make it more interesting. I would like to start by saying something about Sri Aurobindo himself. Facts. Sri Aurobindo was born on August 15th, 1872 in Calcutta. And his father was among the first Indians to go to England for their education. So Sri Aurobindo's father returned entirely anglicized in habits, ideas, ideals, so strongly that as a child, Sri Aurobindo spoke English and Hindustani only, and learned his mother tongue after his return to India in 1893. His father was determined that his children should receive an entirely European upbringing. While in India, they were sent to an Irish nuns' school in Darjeeling. And in 1879, he sent his 3 sons to England and placed them with an English clergyman and his wife, with strict instructions that they should not be allowed to meet any Indian or undergo any Indian influence. So these instructions were carried out to the letter, and Sri Aurobindo grew up in entire ignorance of India, her people, her religion, and her culture. While he was staying with this English family, his first known poetic composition was published in a family magazine. Its meter was based on the well-known poem of Percy Bysshe Shelley, The Cloud. Although Sri Aurobindo himself later spoke of it unappreciatively, I feel that all of us would find it a remarkable achievement for a 10-year-old. It now appears as the first item in Sri Aurobindo's collected poems. So in view of this poem, this first published poem, I feel it's not unjustified to consider Sri Aurobindo as a born poet. He continued to write poetry in a wide variety of styles and meters up to the early 1940s, and continued to expand, revise, and polish Savitri up to a few days before his passing, when he put on his unique epic what his disciple and scribe Nirodbaran has called his seal of imperfect perfection. His education in England had given him a wide introduction to the culture of ancient, medieval, and modern Europe. And he'd become a brilliant scholar in Greek and Latin, had also learned French from his childhood in Manchester, and studied for himself German and Italian sufficiently to read Goethe and Dante in their original tongues. When he returned to India in 1893 at the age of 21, he had almost no knowledge of Indian history and culture. So he made up this deficiency during the 13 years which he spent at Baroda, 1893 to 1906, in the service of the Baroda state. when he taught himself Sanskrit and several modern languages, assimilating the spirit of Indian civilization and its forms, past and present. He did this almost immediately after returning to India, when he was in the service of the Gaikwad and Baroda. After he moved to Pondicherry to escape the unwelcome attentions of the British government, by whom he was considered at that time as the most dangerous man in India, he had the opportunity to begin studying the Vedas in the original, with the help of renowned Tamil scholar Bharatiya, who was also involved in the independence struggle and had taken refuge in the French colony of Pondicherry. So it was possibly at that time that Sri Aurobindo came across the ancient legend of Satyavan and Savitri, which appears as a brief episode in the Indian epic, the Mahabharata, and has become a well-known tale handed down from Indian mothers to their daughters for generations and celebrated annually on a particular day by married women who fast and pray for the welfare of their husbands in memory of Princess Savitri, who by her courage and love was able to save her husband from premature death. In 1908, under the guidance of a Maharashtrian yogi introduced to him by his younger brother Barin, Sri Aurobindo had his first major spiritual realization, which altered his view of the world completely. That experience led on to others, which, combined with his growing understanding of Vedic symbolism, brought him to the conclusion that, contrary to the vision of the view of the Vedas held by European scholars of the time, that these ancient and revered scriptures handed down from generation to generation for thousands of years and forming the bedrock of Indian culture as a whole, were nothing more than barbarous animistic hymns and rituals of ignorant primitive peoples. Sri Aurobindo felt he had a mission to show that instead these wonderful ancient documents could, in fact, when properly understood, provide valuable keys to the highest possible spiritual truths, which could open up for modern humanity insights leading to new and powerful ways of living. In particular, Sri Aurobindo identified the ancient tale of Satyavan and Savitri as providing such keys. His own words tell us that this was the reason why he chose this particular legend as the basis of his poetic masterwork, to which he devoted a great part of his attention over the 35 years from the autumn of 1916, when the earliest known draft of the poem was begun, until the day in mid-November 1950, shortly before he left the mortal frame, when he gave to his disciple Dr. Nirodbaran, who was his scribe during the later stages of the composition of Savitri, what the latter has referred to as Sri Aurobindo's seal of incomplete completion to the epic. So it isn't complete, but he considered that it could stand as complete enough. It's well known that Sri Aurobindo was arrested and kept in prison for a whole year from 1908 to 1909. After his acquittal and release, for a time he continued with his political activities as before. But when he was warned that the British administration intended to arrest him again, he received an inner Adesh instructing him to go to Chandanagar, a suburb of Kolkata, which was under French administration. Following this inner voice, he left Kolkata, first for Chandanagar and then for Pondicherry. And there he was welcomed by a few local nationalists and remained there in hiding for several months. One of those who received and aided him was, as I mentioned, the noted Tamil scholar Subramania Bharatiya. We are told that in his time of seclusion, Sri Aurobindo and Bharatiya studied the Vedas together until the latter's death in 1912. Sri Aurobindo remained in Pondicherry until his passing in 1950. And we know that from a letter to his connection in Chandanagar, Motilal Roy, that around his birthday, 15th of August, 1912, that he said always around his birthday something momentous happened to him. But in this case, he was given the overview of his future work. And this involved presenting a new interpretation and understanding of the Vedas and of the whole basis of Indian culture. And we can see that after the mother and Paul Richard came and visited them, Sri Aurobindo, in 1914, he took up that work in the Arya, there producing articles at an astonishing kind of output monthly, 7 or 8 books at a time, all giving completely new views on various different topics of culture. The future poetry is one of them. And I will say a little more about that later on. The writing of Savitri extended over much of the later part of Sri Aurobindo's life. The earliest known manuscript is dated 1916, autumn 1916. The original narrative poem was recast several times in the first phase of composition. By around 1930, Sri Aurobindo had begun to turn it into an epic with a larger scope and deeper significance than the original narrative. Transformed into a legend and a symbol, Savitri became his major literary work, which he continued to expand and perfect until his last days. In the late 1940s, when his eyesight was failing, he took the help of a scribe. Mother recommended Nirod for that work. And Sri Aurobindo dictated the extensive final stages of revision. Separate cantos started to appear in print in 1946. Part 1 of the first edition of Savitri was published in 1950. And the next year, after Sri Aurobindo's passing, the rest of the poem was brought out in a separate volume. Before going deeper into the details of Sri Aurobindo's epic, we can ask, why do we read Savitri? Fortunately, the mother has answered for us in several ways, in comments made to different disciples. For example, it's well known that she has called this poem the supreme revelation of Sri Aurobindo's vision. And she added, I believe it is his message. All the rest of his writings are the preparations. To some students of the ashram school, she's given the following advice. For the opening of the psychic, for the growth of consciousness, and even for the improvement of English, it is good to read 1 or 2 pages of Savitri each day. And many, many devotees make this a regular practice. I myself can confirm how effective this practice is from the time in the early 1980s, when I was asked to teach English to some German newcomers. Instead of conventional grammar lessons, we decided instead to read a page or 2 of Savitri together each day. And I used to explain the meaning of unfamiliar words, syntax, and imagery. This was the inception of my English of Savitri classes. And I can confirm that my students of that time, who were initially skeptical about this method, have all become fully fluent and confident in English reading and speaking. The mother has said the importance of Savitri is immense. Its subject is universal. Its revelation is prophetic. The time spent in its atmosphere is not wasted. And she has revealed to one of her young disciples that she told him, before starting to write Savitri, Sri Aurobindo told me, I am impelled to start on a new adventure. I was hesitant in the beginning, but now I am decided. Still, I do not know how far I shall succeed. I pray for help. And the day that he actually began it, he told me, I have launched myself in a rudderless boat upon the vastness of the infinite. These words cannot apply to the first known version, which was started in 1916. They must apply to a time after Mother's return to India in 1920. We don't know exactly when, but it's very interesting that he has prayed to her for help in this new venture. And in view of what he has written in his book, The Future Poetry, I'm sure that part of this new venture which he's speaking about is the attempt to achieve the full force of mantra in the English language. And we can attest how well he has succeeded in that. You will know probably these familiar words from Sri Aurobindo. I used Savitri as a means of ascension. I began with it on a certain mental level. Each time I could reach a higher level, I rewrote from that level. Moreover, I was particular. If part seemed to me to come from any lower level, I was not satisfied to leave it because it was good poetry. All had to be as far as possible of the same mint. In fact, Savitri has not been regarded by me as a poem to be written and finished, but as a field of experimentation to see how far poetry could be written from one's own yogic consciousness and how that could be made creative. So this was undoubtedly part of the endeavor of all his work from the early 1930s onwards, until in 1946, Sri Aurobindo wrote about Savitri as it then stood. He wrote to Amal, who had been following the progress of the work for decades, that in the new form, he said, you will find it is something different from what it was when you saw it in the 1930s. In the new form, it will be a sort of poetic philosophy of the spirit and of life, much profounder in its substance and vaster in its scope than was intended in the original poem. I mentioned the earliest known draft of Savitri. There's a set of manuscripts now referred to as the first fair copy or the earliest known draft of Sri Aurobindo's epic Savitri. These manuscripts were discovered unexpectedly after Sri Aurobindo's passing among a pile of papers, neglected papers in his room. 2 old notebooks amongst the papers in his room. The opening of this first known version of the poem is dated August 8 to 9, 1916. It consists of 1,637 lines, to which Amalkiran added 2 further passages, the first of 112 lines found in the notebook, and the second of 21 lines from the second exercise book, making up together a total of 1,770 lines. And these cover almost the whole tale of Savitri and Satyavan, starting from the dawn of the day when Satyavan must die, and ending with the return to earth of Savitri and Satyavan, which in the final version of the epic is described in the first section of Book 12, the epilogue. In those almost 2,000 lines, the narration covers exactly the same sequence as the final version, which we are familiar with today. First, the dawn, the description of Savitri's awakening. Then, just a few lines, Asvapati's tapasya, culminating in his prayer to the goddess Savitri, who grants him the boon of a daughter, followed by the birth, growth, and quest of Savitri. Her meeting with Satyavan, her return to Madra to inform her father that she has found her life's companion, the arrival of Narad and his prophecy of Satyavan's death, Savitri's determination, insistence that she will marry Satyavan, and the fulfillment of her wish when her parents accompany her to the forest hermitage and hand her over to Satyavan's parents. It includes her request to Satyavan's mother, Shaidya, to be allowed to accompany him to the forest on the fated day, which she does with his mother's consent. Satyavan's death in the forest, followed by the journey through the worlds of night and twilight to the world of everlasting day. The first fair copy ends with a description of the fourfold Godhead, which now appears in the second section of Book 11. Amongst the lines added from the exercise book by Amalkiran is a passage giving the response of the Supreme to Savitri's demand for the return of Satyavan to earth, and another which corresponds to the last section of the final version of Book 11. Amalkiran also transcribed some lines from the second exercise book, which now appeared almost unchanged in the first section of Book 12, the epilogue. So this transcript of this first known version covers almost the whole course of the poem which Sri Aurobindo left us in 1950. But instead of being almost 24,000 lines, it's almost 2,000. The first significant difference between the two versions is the title. The final version is subtitled A Legend and a Symbol, but the version found in the notebook and the exercise book was entitled Savitri, A Tale and a Vision. So this change corresponds to the enormous difference which came about in Sri Aurobindo's conception of the poem between 1916 and 1931, when he wrote to Amal Kiran, "There is a previous draft, but it would have been only a legend and not a symbol. I therefore started recasting the whole thing. Only the best passages and lines of the old draft will remain, altered so as to fit in the new frame." Other significant differences are the size of the final version, which Sri Aurobindo continued to work on from around 1930 onwards, adding the whole of books, what is now books 2 and 3, as well as the 2 cantos of book 6. He added the whole of Asvapati's exploration of the subtle worlds and his meeting with the Supreme Divine Mother, as well as the whole of Savitri's yoga, which doesn't appear at all in the first draft. It's described in the 7 cantos of book 7. And the considerably enlarged books 10 and 11, as well as completing book 12, the epilogue, which describes the return of Savitri and Shraddhavan to the earth. The later part of book 11, which contains the consent of the Supreme Lord to the prayers of Savitri, not only for the return of Shraddhavan to earth, but also granting of the aspirations of both Asvapati and herself for the advent of a divine life on earth, for earth and men. That part of book 11 contains 2 significant prophecies. The first of 165 lines, which are addressed to Savitri herself, telling her what will be the result of this great victory for her herself in her future life. It's my feeling that those 165 lines describe, in fact, the state of a supramental life. The second prophecy covers 305 lines and are addressed to Savitri and Shraddhavan jointly. And that prophecy concludes with this powerful promise addressed to us all. More and more souls shall enter into light. Minds lit, inspired, the occult summons here, and lives blaze with a sudden inner flame, and hearts grow enamored of divine delight, and human wills tune with the divine will. Then shall the earth open to divinity. The frontiers of the ignorance shall recede. The spirit shall take up the human play. Nature shall live to manifest secret God. This earthly life become a life divine. I may mention that I was once so fascinated by resemblances that I saw between the final version and the earliest version, that I made a line-by-line comparison of the two versions. And I discovered that more than half of the 1,770 lines transcribed from the earliest version by Amalkiran have been retained and reused by Sri Aurobindo in the course of the many revisions he made between 1916 and 1950, and can still be traced in the final version of 23,873 lines, forming together almost 4% of the whole. I also found it remarkable that certain passages were obviously in Sri Aurobindo's mind from the very beginning. For example, the passage which appears at the end of Book 5 about love. And there are some other very striking passages which must have been in Sri Aurobindo's mind from when he first conceived the idea of making a poem out of this tale, long before it became an epic. When we're reading, it's helpful to notice that when Savitri was nearing completion, Sri Aurobindo divided his poem into 3 parts, covering 12 books and 49 cantos. And these 49 cantos are further subdivided into paragraphs. So what are these 3 parts? Part 1 is by far the biggest one, and the one which Sri Aurobindo revised and worked on most intensely. It consists of Book 1, the Book of Beginnings, which has 5 cantos, and then Book 2, the Book of the Traveler of the Worlds, which shows Asvapati exploring 15 different planes or realms of existence. So, Book 1, Book 2, and then Book 3, the Book of the Divine Mother, where Asvapati comes face to face with the goddess of the Supreme Truth, Savitri herself, who grants his prayer to take birth as a human being in order to hasten the realization of the divine life upon earth. That closes part 1 of Savitri. So it's the Book of Beginnings, the Book of the Traveler of the Worlds, the Book of the Mother. That's part 1. Part 2 tells the story of Savitri, her birth, growing up, marriage. Let me see if I can find it. Part 1 here. In a letter, Sri Aurobindo has revealed that in his poem, the tapasya of King Asvapati falls into 3 stages. So perhaps here I should remind or point out that the original legend of Savitri and Shraddhavan begins with a king, a childless king, a king who is aspiring for 100 sons to become rishis like himself, to rule wisely and justly. He worships the goddess Savitri for 18 years, until at last she appears before him out of the sacrificial fire and tells him that Lord Brahma, the creator, has told her to give him a daughter, and that he should be pleased with this gift of Lord Brahma, because this daughter is going to be worth more than 100 sons to him. That's part of the legend. Sri Aurobindo doesn't exactly include this in his poem. In fact, he starts his poem very, very differently, as you must all know, with the wonderful hour before the gods awake, and then the coming of the symbol dawn, which symbolizes the advent, a divine blessing from the Supreme Divine Mother herself. After which we are introduced to Savitri as she wakes up in the forest on the day when Satyavan must die, as she alone knows. Also in that first book of beginnings, we have a first description of King Asvapati. In Canto 3, we are told, a world's desire compelled her birth. It's because of the aspiration of the whole earth that Savitri has been born. And the one who is responsible for bringing about that change is the aspiration of King Asvapati. Who is shown, and he is shown becoming the traveler of the worlds, passing from the material, the physical, to the subtle realms, and exploring all these different levels of consciousness, one after the other. This is the part of the poem that Sri Aurobindo has expanded most. Part 2 tells the story of Savitri, her birth, her growth, her quest, her meeting with Satyavan, the prophecy of Narad that Satyavan is doomed to die. Very, very special cantos of Book 6, where Sri Aurobindo gives an important role to Savitri's mother, Queen Malati, to express the bewilderment of all of us at the pain and suffering of the innocent, of the world, the grief of the world. Why must it be like this? And Narad, in his role of wise man, answering the queen, comforting her, assuring her that her daughter Savitri is strong enough to face all these challenges and that they should let her go her own way. She has the strength to save herself and the whole world. So that brings the poem to book 7, the book of yoga, of Savitri's yoga. How she is led to start the great search for her soul. The first part of that book, the first part of that first canto of book 7, the second canto of book 7, is familiar to all of us, I think, with this injunction to remember why thou camest. Look into yourself, find your soul, then you will become strong enough to face all the challenges of life, and you will even be able to conquer death. I think not many people look into the second part of that canto. We're told that Savitri realizes that's what she has to do. She has to look into herself and find her soul. And she sits in the night with the rain falling, utterly concentrated like a golden statue, looking into herself. It's much longer than the first part of the canto. It describes in detail, we could say, the whole evolution of humanity. And at the end of that canto, it said that Savitri realizes that all this work of progress and discovery and change, it has already been done in her. And now all that is in her way is just the outer appearances, and she has to push those aside in order to find her soul. And then we see in the successive cantos of book 7, her exploration into the subtle physical, into the vital being, the different mind levels, and her discovery and uniting with her highest self, and her facing of the challenge of the threat of darkness and death, all the hostile forces rise up in a challenge to her. But she is given the strength and given very precise instructions about how to go beyond all this, which are described in the subsequent cantos of book 7, with a final glorious 7th canto, which describes again how she's fully prepared to face the death of Shraddhavan, which comes in the very next canto, canto 8. Do we still have time?
Yes, yes, please.
So I just want to run through the main characters. Let us say that Shraddhavan is the first one because he's the first one who's mentioned in the author's note. So Shraddhavan, his name means one who possesses or embodies the truth. And that is how he's presented in the poem. He's the young prince living in the forest with his parents because his father, King Dyumatsena, has been exiled from his kingdom when he lost his eyesight. For in those days, it was impossible for a king to continue to rule if he was disabled in any way. Satyavan becomes the chosen partner of Princess Savitri, who is the incarnation of the Supreme Divine Mother, after whom she's been named. Her name implies that she's the daughter of the Son of Truth, the Shakti of Lord Brahma, the Creator, an embodiment of the creative word, the eternal yes. Aswapati, Savitri's father, the king of Madra, is the main protagonist of the first part of the poem, the whole of part 1. I would like to say a little more about him before moving on to the rest of the poem. But first I can mention the other, what we could call minor characters, other characters. There is Narad, a semi-divine being, a musician and devotee of Lord Vishnu, who is able to move freely between the heavens and the earth and has the power of seeing past, present, and future. Also in book 6, we have the appearance of Malati, Savitri's mother, Aswapati's queen, to whom Aurobindo has assigned an important role in this book of fate. Satyavan also has a mother. Her name is Shaibya. She's the queen of Dyumatsena. She has accompanied her husband and son into exile in the forest. And of course, the other most important main character is the god of death, who is not called Yama in this poem, but he plays that role of Yama, who is not only the god who keeps everything in order in the universe by dissolving what needs to be dissolved. He's also the god of dharma, of law and right conduct. In the course of Savitri's quest, she encounters 3 Madonnas, and who explain to her how they represent the soul in different ways. The Madonna of pity and compassion, the Madonna of might, of power, and the Madonna of light. Of wisdom and progress. It's one of the most colorful sections of the poem, because each of these Madonnas, after having explained their role in our soul development, each of them is challenged by an echo coming from the lower levels of our nature, where they proclaim all the negatives which go with these positive qualities which are embodied by the Madonnas. Very interesting is the response of Savitri to the last of the Madonnas. She tells her, it's no use trying to make human beings more intelligent and sensitive. Whatever improvements you bring, they will only think that's just normal. What you have to do is to encourage the sense of longing for a higher reality, the aspiration for a greater truth. And only in that way can humanity reach its true goal. I like to just read a few lines about Asvapati, because I feel he's such a key figure. He's the one who embodies the desire of the earth for a divine life. And in order to help bring that about, he's the one who explores all the different levels of consciousness. We can't help feeling that, as Nirod has told us, this part of the poem, part one of the poem, the explorations of King Asvapati, that this is Sri Aurobindo's autobiography. Here are some of the things which the poet tells us about this great Rishi king. His was a spirit that stooped from larger spheres into our province of ephemeral sight, a colonist from immortality. His human self, like a translucent cloak, covered the all-wise who leads the unseeing world. Although consenting to mortal ignorance, his knowledge shared the light ineffable. His days were a long growth to the supreme. His soul lived as eternity's delegate. His mind was like a fire assailing heaven. His will, a hunter in the trails of light. A wide God knowledge poured down from above, and new world knowledge broadened from within. His daily thoughts looked up to the true and one. His commonest doings welled from an inner light. One and harmonious by the Maker's skill, the human in him paced with the divine. His acts betrayed not the interior flame. This forged the greatness of his front to earth. Apart he lived in his mind's solitude, a demigod shaping the lives of men. One soul's ambition lifted up the race. A power worked, but none knew whence it came. The universal strengths were linked with his. filling earth's smallness with their boundless breadths. He drew the energies that transmute an age. Immeasurable by the common look, he made great dreams a mold for coming things, and cast his deeds like bronze to front the years. His walk through time outstripped the human stride. Lonely his days, and splendid like the sun's. So, as I mentioned before, we have to see Asvapati as the major protagonist of the first part of Sri Aurobindo's epic. He becomes the traveler of the worlds, exploring all the planes and realms of cosmic existence, from the most material to the highest and subtlest, and from the greatest and purest light to the deepest and most dreadful darkness and danger. He experiences the silent self of mind. He experiences the realm of the world soul, and finally reaches the kingdoms of the greater knowledge, and sets out to go even further on his pursuit of the unknowable and his adoration of the Divine Mother. At last, she grants him the boon which he has been aspiring for. She promises him, "O strong forerunner, I have heard thy cry. One shall descend and break the iron law, change nature's doom by the lone spirit's power. She shall bear wisdom in her voiceless bosom. Strength shall be with her like a conqueror's sword, and from her eyes the eternal's bliss shall gaze. A seed shall be sown in death's tremendous hour. A branch of heaven transplant to human soil. Nature shall overleap her mortal step. Fate shall be changed by an unchanging will." This promise from the Supreme Divine Mother marks the end of Asvapati's quest. He will return to rule his kingdom, and a daughter will be born to him who will eventually fulfill all that he has worked to achieve. His quest will be crowned and fulfilled by his daughter, Savitri. Perhaps we can stop there, but we had some questions, no? What are those questions? Yeah.
If you have a question now, you can send it to me privately in the chat. And Shraddhavan, did you have the list of questions that people submitted beforehand?
There are only 3. Do you want to do it like that?
Sure.
Or shall I just answer the questions?
Like that, meaning?
Meaning first giving the questions to you and then the answers? Or there are just 3 questions.
Yeah, no, you can read the questions that were submitted ahead of time. I was just suggesting that anyone who has a question,
Anybody who has a question, now they can submit
exactly,
it.
who hasn't submitted it before can feel free to submit it to me privately in the chat, but we also have these 3 questions that you can go ahead with. And if you need me to find them and read them, I can.
One question was from
I have the list here.
you have the list, yes. So you read out the questions.
Okay. So, question number 1.
It's about Satyavan.
Yes, I'm sorry, well, we know that Satyavan represents the soul of the world. Could you please speak about Satyavan and how his relationship with Savitri translates to our individual personal relationship with the Divine Mother?
Yes. Well, the author's note tells us that the mother has come down. She has taken birth here, a human birth, with us in this world to save. She's come, of course, to save Satyavan, who represents the soul of the world. But she's come to save all our souls also. She's come to save all her children, not only her human children, all her animal and flower children, all beings. So I think that means that everybody who is having difficulties, struggles, feels challenged by life, by the way the world is, our mother has promised her help and blessings to be with us all as her children, and we can rely on that. I don't know whether that satisfies Karundas.
Well, there's a follow-up question that was just sent to me by Raja that you in some way answered, but the question is the poem, it's a 2-part question. Is the poem Savitri optimistic about the human race? Number 1. And number 2, he's asking, who is Savitri in the poem?
Well, I think now we just ran through the poem and we've seen who is Savitri. She's the daughter of King Aswapati, but she's been born as a consequence of this promise to send an embodiment of the Supreme Divine Mother to the world to fulfill Aswapati's quest, his quest for a divine life upon earth. He does a certain amount, he receives the blessings of the Supreme Divine Mother, but finally she blesses him with this promise that yes, one shall descend, and the mother is that one. So it's a kind of joint work. That the first part of the poem is the main protagonist is Asvapati. In the second part of the poem, the main protagonist is Savitri. And in the third part, the main protagonist for most of the time is Yama, the god of death. And he is the one, there's this amazing dialogue of death. So I had a question about that. I think, why do you think that Sri Aurobindo has conjured up such a dark space in this book, in book 10 he's referring to? Do you think this is also a description of some real spiritual state? And he says in the Mahabharata, the treatment of this relationship between, or this dialogue between Savitri and death is completely different. It's not treated in the same way at all. And I think that is because Sri Aurobindo's purpose is quite different from that of the original legend. I think that in this book 10, Sri Aurobindo very wonderfully expresses to us the gulf between our human way of seeing things and the divine way that Savitri can reveal things. So what death is always doing is showing us the dark, pessimistic side of things. Just the way that we express it ourselves in life. Our weaknesses, our complaints, the arguments that he uses, they are our arguments. We find them very convincing. But fortunately, Sri Aurobindo has put Savitri there. She answers. She says, you, death, you're speaking truth, but it's a destructive kind of truth. It's a truth that slays, which destroys. I'm telling you, I'm giving you the truth that saves. And she insists on doing that and continuing to do that and giving some of the most extraordinarily touching and beautiful expressions of the truth that saves. That we happen to know that Mother took up book 10 to translate into French. She translated almost all of it into French. And she said, I'm not doing this to share with anybody. I'm doing this for myself. This way, I'm learning from Sri Aurobindo. It's the only thing of his that I hadn't gone into before. Now I'm learning from Sri Aurobindo. And she obviously enjoyed, reveled in this, this contrast. She would laugh at this figure of death. How cheeky he is, how unbearable he is. How dare he say these things? And then Savitri herself gives us these so wonderfully memorable responses. One of the things that sticks always in my mind that she says, earth is the chosen place of heroic souls. And I have come to realize that that's such a great truth, that perhaps every human soul is a heroic soul in facing all that has to be faced between a birth and a death. But through that, we are the human race as a whole, with the blessings and help of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, is moving forward to diviner life. just exactly as she promises. It shall be done. And you can go and have a look at these wonderful prophecies that come in Book 11. First, the prophecy of the Supreme Lord, that yes, your thoughts are my thoughts, your words are my words, everything you've asked for, it will be given to you. But because you've turned away from all those boons that I was offering, now you are going to have to live through something that will maybe also be a kind of ordeal. Such an intensity of experience. It's almost impossible to imagine. But as I said earlier, perhaps this is a glimpse of what a supramental life can be like. And then Savitri is told, so now everything's been fulfilled. You can go back to earth with the one you love. And she then is given, or Savitri and Shraddhavan are given a prophecy of what this victory will mean for earth in the future. And finally, the life divine shall be realized on earth.
There's a quite profound question from Mudit. Why does Savitri need to undergo yoga, being the savior?
Well, she starts off as just an ordinary girl. No? Well, not quite ordinary, but a princess. So I think Sri Aurobindo felt that it was important to show these steps of yoga. And they cover the 3 steps which belong to Sri Aurobindo's yoga. First is the psychic discovery and realization. It's always in 2 steps. First, there's the discovery, and then there's the realization. So first, the psychic. Then the second is to do with the abnegation of the ego. Accept to be nothing and know that thou mayst be all. And there's a very, very helpful, if we follow then the steps of progress that are shown to her in her realization of her divinity, step by step by step. This is a textbook of yoga. We can follow those steps one by one. Silencing of the mind and starting from the observing of the thoughts, where they come from, what effect they have. And then she reaches a realization similar to Sri Aurobindo's nirvana experience. But she is able to go beyond that also. It's as if she experiences the fulfillment of the Gayatri mantra. That can, the traditional Gayatri mantra, Sri Aurobindo tells us, aims to purify the mind. But he says, my Gayatri can transform all the levels of existence. So something like that happens to Savitri at the end of book 7. And that's the final preparation for her, for the death of Savitri, the death of Satyabhan, when we turn 2 pages. That death comes and she's fully prepared to deal with his departure And then with this battle she has to have with the god of death in order to bring him back to the earth alive. It's as if everything that she's been taught in that experience in the book of yoga, all the steps, every one of them, they get tested in book 10. And then there's a further set of tests that come in book 11. They're much more, much less dreadful, but they are tests, nevertheless, very stringent tests. So she passes all the tests. And her prayer is, she says, all these things that you've been tempting me with, Lord, all this peace and oneness and all this. Yes, give me all these boons, but not for me myself. You give to me for earth and men. And in that she's echoing exactly the prayer of King Aswapati to the Supreme Divine Mother. Shall we leave it there for tonight?
Sure. Yes, it's been an hour and a half.
Really? Thanks. Thanks to Aurobindo.
Thank you so much, Shraddhavan.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.
It's a touching miracle of this moment that we can be all in our own homes all around the world and sit with you and receive your lifetime of wisdom about Savitri.
Yes, something has something dark and terrible has happened with this pandemic, but somehow flowers are growing out of it. No? We can be grateful for that.
And of course, thank you all for joining, and the recording will be sent out to the email address that you used to register. So look for that. Probably by Monday that will happen. And I thank you all also for your contributions. All the donations that were collected for this event are going to support Aurobindo Unity Fund, which provides kind of basic shared needs for Aurobillians, including infrastructure, schools, roads, maintenances, healthcare, all the basic necessities of living for Aurobillians. So during this complicated time, we're so grateful for all of your contributions to support Aurobindo in such a basic way.
So I can thank you also, Matthew, for, I feel as if he's just sitting here, sitting there. Thank you for organizing all this. It's a kind of quite a feat of organization, I think, to pull all this together. Thank you. Thank you for the effort.
Yeah, of course. It's an honor.
Au revoir. Au revoir.
Goodbye. Thank you all.